There is a moment, quiet, surgical, and completely irreversible, when a powerful man destroys himself in front of everyone who ever feared him. Damien Varelli thought he was making a statement. He was, just not the one he intended. Before 300 witnesses, he stripped the most sacred symbol of Varelli authority from his wife's neck and draped it around his mistress. The room stopped breathing. Then Serena Vale did something no one expected. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She set down her ring, picked up nothing, and walked out. By morning, an empire was bleeding from a wound its king couldn't even see yet. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to hurt. The ballroom of the Castello Nero had been dressed for power. Every chandelier in the vaulted ceiling blazed at full capacity, throwing down light so clean and merciless it left no shadows, anywhere a man might hide his expression. The walls were draped in black silk threaded with gold, the Varelli crest embossed above the main stage in hammered bronze, but a serpent coiled around a crown, its tongue extended, its eyes made of real onyx that caught the light and threw it back cold. Round tables filled the floor in concentric rings, each one set with linen so white it hurt to look at directly, with crystal glassware and silverware so heavy it made a sound like a judge's gavel when it was laid down. 300 people occupied those chairs. Not guests, witnesses. This was founding night. The single evening each year when the Varelli syndicate gathered every allied boss, every captain, every broker, every neutral power worth acknowledging, and reminded all of them exactly who held the center of the world they lived inside. It was tradition in the oldest sense, not ceremony for the sake of sentiment, but ritual designed to recalibrate fear, to refresh it, to make it new again in the bodies of men who had grown comfortable and needed reminding what comfort cost. Serena Val Varelli stood at the head table and watched the room fill. She had been doing this for 11 years, standing at the precise coordinates where Damien's left shoulder met the open air, close enough to be seen, far enough not to interfere. She wore black tonight. She always wore black on founding night. It was expected. It was correct. A gown cut with the kind of architectural severity that announced its wearer had stopped caring about being beautiful and had moved into something more permanent. Her hair was up. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had learned early that the only way to survive a room full of predators was to make your spine into something they couldn't read as prey. The ancestral necklace rested at her collarbone, as it always did on this night. A cascade of black diamonds set in oxidized platinum, the oldest piece the Varelli family owned, older than the syndicate itself, handed down through 4 generations of women who had stood in exactly this position and understood what wearing it meant. It meant, this woman is the axis. Touch her, and you touch everything. Damien stood 3 feet away, working the room the way he always worked it. Handshakes that lasted a half-second too long, eye contact held a beat past comfort, the particular smile that men like him practiced until it looked effortless. He was not an unimpressive man. At 51, he was still built like the enforcer he'd been at 28. The weight redistributed slightly, but the presence unchanged, the physical fact of him still landing in rooms before his words did. He had the voice of someone who had never once in his adult life needed to raise it to be obeyed. Serena watched him greet Marco Caretti, who ran the Northern Port operations. She watched him clasp the shoulder of Vincent Halsey, who controlled 3 appeals court judges and a deputy commissioner of customs. She watched him lean close to Benedict Rowe, the eldest of the independent brokers, who smiled with his mouth closed and said something that made Damien laugh. A real laugh, the one that reached his eyes, the one he used when he wanted someone to believe he was relaxed. She had seen that laugh directed at her once, a long time ago. Celeste Arden arrived at 8:17. Serena knew the exact time because she had been watching the main entrance the way she watched everything in this room, with the patience of someone who had been paying attention since before the other person knew they were being observed. Celeste came in through the east arch rather than the main doors, which was a choice, not an accident, because the east arch put her in Serena's sightline first and Damien's second, and whoever had coached her on that entrance understood the psychology of the room. She was 29. She was the kind of beautiful that other women recognized before men did. Not the soft decorative kind, but the sharp functional kind. The kind that understood its own leverage and applied it deliberately. She wore red. At a Varelli founding night, red. Serena picked up her champagne glass and did not drink from it. She had known about Celeste for 14 months. Not suspected. Known, with documentation, with timelines, with the specific knowledge of a woman who had built her understanding of this world from the ground up, and therefore understood exactly what information was worth keeping and exactly when it would matter. She had not confronted Damien. She had not wept. She had not confided in anyone. She had done what she had always done when she identified a threat. She had prepared. What she had not fully calculated, what she was recalculating now, watching Celeste cross the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the night was already won, was the specific form the humiliation would take. She had known it was coming. She had not known it would be here, in front of all of them. Damien crossed to Celeste at 8:22. He did not touch her immediately, which was its own statement. The restraint was performative, a man demonstrating that he could control his own desire, which meant everyone in the room understood that the desire was there to be controlled. They spoke for 90 seconds. Serena tracked the room's awareness of it, the flicker of attention in Benedict Rowe's eyes, the deliberate stillness of Marco Caretti's hands, the way Vincent Halls turned his body 40 degrees away and became very interested in his wine. Men who knew something was happening and had already decided not to be in the center of it. Then Damien turned and walked toward the head table, toward Serena. He moved through the room the way the sea moves through a channel, not hurrying, not hesitating, the crowd parting without being asked because his body had learned over decades to expect the parting and the crowd had learned over decades to provide it. Serena set her champagne glass down. She kept her hands still at her sides. She kept her face in the configuration she had been trained to keep it in. Composed, present, unreadable. But underneath her sternum, something had begun to close, the way a door closes when the wind outside shifts, not slamming, just sealing. He stopped in front of her. Serena. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. A man who raises his voice is afraid. A man who lowers it has already decided. Damien. He reached up. His hands, she had held those hands, had felt them against her face in the early years when there had been something between them worth calling tenderness, went to the clasp of the ancestral necklace. She felt the cold brush of his fingers at the back of her neck and stood completely still. Not because she was frozen, because she had decided, some number of hours or days or months before this moment, that she would not give him the satisfaction of a flinch. The necklace came away. The weight of it left her throat, and she felt the absence like a pressure change, like the moment before a storm when the air loses all its substance. 300 people were not breathing. Damien walked back across the ballroom floor with the necklace held open in both hands. The black diamonds caught every chandelier in the room as he moved, throwing small, cold constellations across the ceiling. Celeste Arden stood very still in the center of the east aisle and watched him come to her, and her expression, Serena was watching it from across the room, had trained herself over 11 years to read the micro-expressions of people operating under the pressure of a public moment, was not triumph. It was the practiced neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this scene and was now executing it. She had been told what tonight was. She had dressed for it. Damien clasped the necklace around Celeste Arden's neck. He stepped back. He turned to face the room. Serena looked down at her champagne glass. The bubbles were still rising. The champagne was still cold. Small things. Real things. She looked at her wedding ring, platinum, plain, the width of 2 stacked coins, worn smooth on the inside from 11 years of contact with the skin of her finger. She thought about nothing specific. She thought about the particular quality of silence that fills a room when 300 people simultaneously choose not to react. She worked the ring off her finger with her thumb. It came away without resistance. She set it beside the untouched champagne glass with a small, precise click that she was certain no one beyond the nearest table could have heard. Then she turned and walked toward the south exit. She did not look back. This was not bravado. This was not performance. The decision not to look back was a practical one. She had already looked at everything in this room that mattered, had been looking at it for 11 years, and there was nothing left in it she needed to see. The south corridor was empty. Her footsteps on the marble floor were the only sound, and they were steady and they did not hurry. She took the service elevator to the parking level. The car she had positioned there 3 days ago, not a Varelli car, not traceable to any account or name connected to Damien, was waiting with a go-bag in the trunk that contained everything she needed for the next 48 hours. She had planned this exit with the same meticulous patience she had applied to everything else. She had not known when she would need it. She had known she would. Behind her, 2 floors up, she heard the distant amplified voice of the Master of Ceremonies beginning the loyalty oath, the ancient tradition that capped every founding night, in which every capo rose to acknowledge the authority of the Varelli First Lady. She pressed the elevator button. She heard, distantly and through concrete, the silence that answered the Master of Ceremonies' command. Not applause, not the scrape of chairs on marble as 300 people rose. Silence. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She did not allow herself to feel what she was feeling. Not yet, not here, not until she was somewhere the walls couldn't hear it. She had made a decision 11 years ago when she understood what kind of man she had married and what kind of world she had agreed to inhabit. She would survive it. She would be useful inside it. And when it ended, she would be the one who decided how. The elevator reached the parking level and the doors opened and she walked to the car. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 4 seconds. Then she started the engine and drove. Ate. Damien Varelli stood at the center of his ballroom and waited for the chairs to move. They did not move. The Master of Ceremonies, a thin man named Piotr, who had performed this specific ceremony for 19 consecutive years and had the careful composure of someone whose job required him to be visibly untroubled by anything, said it again. The phrasing of the Varelli loyalty oath was not improvised. Every word had been fixed for decades, passed down through the same oral tradition as the rest of the ceremony. All capos of the Varelli family and allied houses stand and acknowledge your Donna. Nobody stood. Damien's smile did not leave his face immediately. It lingered for 3 or 4 seconds past the point at which it made sense. The smile of a man whose face had not yet received the message his nervous system was transmitting. Then it faded in a way that was not dramatic, not sudden, but gradual, like the light going out of a room when the sun moves behind a cloud. Marco Caretti was looking at the tablecloth. Vincent Halls was looking at his wine. Benedict Rowe, the eldest of the independent brokers, was looking directly at Damien with an expression that contained nothing. No malice, no sympathy, no apology. The expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a number and was now simply waiting for the meeting to be over. Celeste Arden stood at Damien's side with the ancestral necklace around her throat and her hand half raised to touch it, and her face, for the first time tonight, had broken from its rehearsed composure into something that looked genuinely uncertain. The silence lasted 30 seconds. In a room that size, among men who lived inside a world that ran on the physics of dominance and deference, 30 seconds of silence in response to a loyalty oath was not a pause. It was a verdict. Damien said quietly, still using the low voice, "Piotr." Again. Piotr said it again. Nobody moved. Damien turned away from the room. He walked to the side door off the main stage, the door reserved for the family, the one that opened into the private corridor where conversations happened that couldn't happen in public. And he opened it and stepped through it and closed it behind him. His security chief, a man named Rourke, who had been with him for 8 years, fell in beside him immediately. "Where is she?" Damien said. "We're looking." "That's not what I asked." "She left through the South Service exit approximately." "Find her." He was still not raising his voice. The absence of volume in a man like Damien Varelli was not calmness. It was compression, the kind of pressure that precedes detonation. "Find her tonight. I want her in front of me before morning." "Yes, sir." "And the cars?" "Already on it." "And the phones?" "Sir." Rourke stopped walking. This was unusual enough that Damien stopped too and turned and looked at him. Rourke was a man who had delivered bad news before. He had a way of doing it, a specific settling of his weight, a lowering of his chin, that Damien had learned to read over 8 years as the preamble to something he was not going to want to hear. The phones are already off. Damien stared at him. All of them, Rourke said. The main lines, the secondary lines, the encrypted network, everything routed through the Costello's communication system went dark approximately, he checked his watch, 12 minutes ago. What? 12 minutes. Damien ran the math backward. 12 minutes ago, Serena had been in the elevator. That's not possible, Damien said. The system is… I know what the system is. I'm telling you what it's doing. Rourke held eye contact. Sir, it's not a malfunction. The corridor they were standing in was all marble and old wood and the particular kind of hush that expensive buildings maintained even when the rooms behind their walls were in crisis. From somewhere far away, through 2 doors and 100 feet of stone, Damien could hear the murmur of 300 people beginning to talk among themselves, the sound of the evening unraveling into something no ceremony could contain. He turned and kept walking. He needed to think. He needed a room without witnesses and a phone that worked, and the kind of silence that allowed a man to assess exactly how badly he had miscalculated, and from which direction the damage was coming and which pieces could still be salvaged. What he did not need, what he was furiously refusing to construct inside his own mind as he walked, was the specific image of Serena Vale sitting quietly at a head table for 11 years with the patience of a woman who had been waiting, very calmly, for exactly this night. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was also not a man who lied to himself about what fear felt like. In his chest, behind the composure and the anger and the already building architecture of blame, something cold had taken up residence, something that felt less like fury and more like the specific dread of a man who has just realized that the trap closed before he ever saw the door. Outside, in a plain car on a rain-wet road 30 miles from the Castello Nero, Serena Vale drove north with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and her face in the dark, holding an expression that nobody, not even the man who had spent 11 years sleeping beside her, had ever been permitted to see. She did not look like a woman who had been humiliated. She looked like a woman who had just started something. And somewhere in the overnight silence of 3 continents, in banks and ports and private offices, and the personal phones of men who owed their stability to agreements they had made with a woman whose name did not appear on any public document, phones were receiving messages. Accounts were receiving instructions. Locks were engaging. And the machinery that Damien Varelli had spent 30 years building, brick by bloody brick, began in the dark of that night to come quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably apart. He just didn't know it yet. By morning, he would. The first call Damien made at 4 a.m. went unanswered. He stood in the private study on the 3rd floor of the Castello Nero, a room that smelled of old paper and cigarette smoke absorbed into the wood over decades, and listened to the line ring 9 times before it cut to silence. Not voicemail. Silence. He tried the 2nd number. Same result. The 3rd number belonged to a man named Arquette, who ran the offshore clearinghouse through which every wire transfer above $2 million moved before it reached its destination. Arquette answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he already knew. Arquette. A pause that lasted too long. Mr. Varelli. I need a status report on the Cayman accounts. Another pause. There's been a flag on those accounts, sir. What kind of flag? A compliance hold. It came through at… Damien could hear paper moving, or the man pretending to look at paper when he already knew what he was about to say. At 23:41 last night, 23:41. 11:41 in the evening, 19 minutes after Serena walked out of the ballroom. Remove it, Damien said. I can't remove it, sir. It didn't originate from inside our system. It came from the primary signatory. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. I am the primary signatory. The pause this time was the longest yet, and inside it, Damien heard something he had not heard from a man on his payroll in longer than he could remember. The specific quality of silence that meant the person on the other end was weighing whether the truth was worth the consequence of delivering it. On those accounts, Arquette said carefully, the primary signatory is listed as S. Vale. Damien ended the call. He sat down in the chair behind the desk. His father's chair, oxblood leather, brass studs along the armrests worn to bare metal where 2 generations of Virelli hands had gripped them. And he sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then he picked up the desk phone and called Rourke. "Get me every document associated with the offshore accounts," he said. "Every signatory page, every registration certificate, everything. I want it in this room in 20 minutes. "Sir, the document archive is 20 minutes, Rourke." He hung up. He stood. He walked to the window that overlooked the Castello's rear courtyard, where a fountain that hadn't run water in 3 years stood in the center of the cobblestones, its basin full of rainwater and dead leaves. The sky above the courtyard was the specific dark gray that preceded dawn. Not black anymore, not light yet, the color of something that hadn't decided what it was going to be. He thought about Serena's face in the moment before he reached for the necklace. He had looked at her directly. He remembered that, had in fact made a point of it, a cruelty he had dressed to himself as honesty. And her expression had been what it always was, composed, present, unreadable. He had interpreted that composure as pride, as the discipline of a woman who refused to show weakness in a room full of predators. He had felt something almost like respect for it, beneath the contempt, the way a man can admire the structural integrity of a building he is in the process of demolishing. He understood now that he had misread it entirely, that composure had not been discipline. It had been the expression of a woman watching a plan execute. He turned away from the window. Rourke arrived in 17 minutes with 2 men carrying a document case. Damien went through the files himself, standing at the desk, pulling pages and reading them with the focused speed of a man who had spent 30 years learning which words on a legal document carried the weight and which were decoration. It took him 11 minutes to find what Arquette had told him was there. 17 accounts. 11 of them listed Serena Vale as primary signatory, with Damien Virelli listed as secondary. He had signed these documents himself. He remembered signing them, years ago, different times, always in the context of Serena saying, "This is the structure the banks require. The compliance framework demands a named individual with clean documentation. Your name carries flags in 3 jurisdictions, so we route it through mine." He had signed. He had not read. He had trusted the machine to run because the machine had always run, and he had never once stopped to ask whose hands were actually on it. "Rourke," he said, without looking up from the pages. "Sir, how many of our allied agreements, the ones with the neutral families, the broker arrangements, the port access contracts, how many of them went through Serena's office rather than the main legal department?" Silence. Damien looked up. Rourke was a man whose face gave away very little, which was why Damien had kept him for 8 years. What it gave away now was the thing Damien had already begun to suspect, the look of a man standing in a burning building who has just realized the fire is not an accident. "I don't have an exact number," Rourke said. "Estimate." Rourke looked at the wall behind Damien's left shoulder. "Most of them," he said. By 6 in the morning, Damien had confirmation of 4 things. The northern shipping routes, 3 separate freight corridors that moved goods through ports in a manner that the manifest documents described as agricultural equipment and the actual contents emphatically were not, had been suspended pending re-verification of carrier credentials. The suspension had been requested by the inspection authority at each port simultaneously, at midnight, using language that had the specific bureaucratic fingerprints of someone who understood exactly which regulatory lever to pull to cause maximum disruption with minimum visibility. The legal firm that handled Virelli contract disputes, a 50-year-old institution with partners who had spent their careers developing the particular skill of making certain problems disappear from certain dockets, had sent a letter, delivered by courier to the Castello Nero at 5:45 in the morning, which informed Damien that they were withdrawing from representation effective immediately, citing irreconcilable conflicts of interest, and that all files pertaining to his matters would be transferred to a neutral archive pending collection. The letter was signed by the senior partner, a man named Holst, who had attended Damien's father's funeral and who Damien had considered, in the imprecise way of men who confuse professional loyalty with personal feeling, a friend. A message relayed through 3 intermediaries from Benedict Rowe said only, "Not a good time to reach out," 7 words. From a man who had built a 30-year career on elaborate courtesy, 7 words was a declaration. And Marcus Teal, the deputy commissioner whose relationship with the Varelli family predated Damien's own leadership, who had provided advance warning on 47 separate occasions when regulatory attention was drifting in an inconvenient direction, who had been compensated for this service to the tune of $200,000 annually deposited in increments so small and irregular they vanished into noise. Marcus Teal had not answered his private line, his office line, or the emergency number that had never once in 11 years gone unanswered. Damien sat in the study with all of this in front of him and felt something happening inside his chest that he did not have a clean name for. It was not panic. Panic was acute. It spiked. It broke. This was different. It was a slow structural thing, like the way a building settles when its foundation shifts, the long groan of weight redistribution, the hairline cracks appearing in walls that had seemed solid. He had been in bad situations before. He had been in situations that looked like catastrophe and resolved into manageable damage. He had a 30-year record of turning the tide. The tide had always been turnable because there had always been a pressure point, a man to be bought, a threat to be applied, a lever in the correct position. He was beginning to understand that the machinery he had always relied on to locate those levers had been built by someone else entirely. Celeste knocked on the study door at 6:30. She was still wearing last night's dress. The red fabric looked different in morning light, less like a declaration, more like a mistake. The ancestral necklace was still at her throat. She had not taken it off, which told Damien something about her read of the situation that he did not find reassuring. She thought the thing to do in a crisis was hold position, perform continuity, pretend the question of authority wasn't already answered. It was the instinct of someone who had been given a script and didn't know what to do when the scene changed. "Damien," she closed the door behind her. "I've been hearing things from the staff." "What things?" "That the phones aren't working, that some of the men left last night after the ceremony ended the way it did." She paused. "That there are people outside the gate." "What people?" "I don't know. Rourke won't tell me." "Then ask Rourke." Her jaw tightened. "I'm asking you." He looked at her. In the months he had spent constructing last night's plan, the arrangement with Celeste, the decision about the ceremony, the particular form of the public statement he intended to make, he had focused on the effect he wanted to produce and had given considerably less thought to what came after. Celeste had been a variable he'd calculated as simple. She wanted position. She wanted the title and the visibility and the particular protection that came with being publicly claimed by a man like Damien Varelli. He had intended to provide that. He had not modeled the version of events in which the position became worthless at the moment of acquisition. "There are associates outside the gate who came this morning," he said. "It's a response to last night. It will be managed." Managed how? Her voice had an edge he hadn't heard before. Not the cultivated softness she'd deployed in private, but something underneath it, something harder and less patient. "Because what I'm hearing is that the phones are down and the lawyers withdrew, and Benedict Rowe sent a message this morning that nobody will show me, Celeste, and Serena is gone and nobody knows where she is, and you're sitting in here alone at 6 in the morning looking like a man who just found out the floor is Celeste." He said it the second time differently, lower, slower, with the particular compression that usually ended conversations. She stopped, but she didn't look away, which was new. "Go get some sleep. I'll handle this." "You said that last night too," she said. "Right before everything stopped working." She left. He listened to her footsteps recede down the marble corridor and thought that she was smarter than he had given her credit for, which was its own kind of problem because smart people, when they recognized a sinking structure, started looking for a way off it. The call he'd been waiting for came at 8:47, not from Serena, from Marco Coretti, who ran the northern ports, and who Damien had considered one of his most reliable captains. A man without ideology or sentiment, entirely transactional, which usually meant entirely predictable. "Marco," Damien said, "I need to talk to you." Coretti's voice was flat. not hostile, flat in the way of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and is now executing it without effect. In person, today. Come to the Castello. Not the Castello. A pause. Somewhere neutral. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Neutral. A word with a specific meaning in their world. It meant outside the host territory, in a space where neither party held home advantage, which was the meeting format used between parties of equal standing or between parties whose relationship had become adversarial. Marco Coretti had been his captain for 9 years. He had never once, in 9 years, requested a neutral location. The Meridian Club, Damien said. Noon. I'll be there, Coretti said, and hung up. Damien called Rourke. I want 4 men at the Meridian Club by 10. I want the room checked. I want... Sir. Rourke's voice had the quality again. The weight-shifting quality. Coretti won't be the only one. I've had 3 other captains request meetings this morning. Halza, Brennan, Tao. 4 captains. In 11 years, Damien had never had 4 captains request meetings on the same morning. In 11 years, he'd rarely needed to meet with captains at all. The structure he'd inherited and expanded was designed to operate through intermediaries, through layers of insulation, through the smooth hydraulic pressure of an organization that moved, because everyone inside it understood that the alternative to movement was being ground between the gears. The captains didn't call meetings, they received instructions. Set it for noon, Damien said. All of them, same room. He ended the call and stood with the phone in his hand and let himself, for the first time since last night, fully inhabit the shape of what was happening. Not the crisis management version. The version where he was already 3 moves ahead, already identifying the pressure points, already constructing the narrative that would reframe the night's events as a test of loyalty rather than a demonstration of catastrophic misjudgment. That version was still running in a part of his mind, but underneath it, in the part he didn't perform for anyone, he was looking at this with the unflinching attention that had kept him alive for 30 years, and he was seeing it clearly. This was not a problem. This was a structural failure, and it had happened because he had looked at the mechanism that held his empire together and seen only the visible parts, the men, the money, the threat of violence, the tradition of fear, and had not looked at the connective tissue underneath it. The tissue that was invisible precisely because the person who had built it had been careful to remain invisible herself. He had removed her publicly, in front of everyone who mattered, and the connective tissue had dissolved. He was standing in a building whose mortar had just become sand. The Meridian Club occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the financial district that had been converted from a private bank in the 1940s and had maintained ever since the specific atmosphere of an institution that considered discretion a form of architecture. The walls were dark wood, the lighting was low and directional. The staff had been selected over generations for the quality that the club's founder had described in its original charter as the grace of strategic deftness. Damien arrived at 11:40. His 4 men had cleared the room. The table in the private dining room on the upper floor was set for 5, which meant somewhere between his call with Rourke and now a 5th captain had added themselves to the meeting. He was looking at the place settings when the door opened and Marco Coretti came in. And behind Coretti came Halza, and behind Halza came Brennan, and behind Brennan came Tao, and behind Tao came a man that Damien had not expected, and whose presence in this room sent a specific charge through the base of his spine that he recognized, after 30 years, as the body's primitive response to finding a predator in a space you thought was safe. Benedict Rowe, the eldest independent broker, who had requested a neutral location, who had sent a 7-word message this morning, who was not a Virelli captain and had no standing at a table of Virelli captains, and whose presence here meant something that Damien could feel in his teeth before his brain had finished assembling the sentence. Benedict, Damien said. He kept his voice even. He sat down at the head of the table because the head of the table was where he always sat, and removing that from the visual was a concession he was not prepared to make. Damien, Rowe sat across from him. The 4 captains distributed themselves along the sides. Nobody touched the water glasses. Nobody opened the menus that had been placed as theatrical props on the table. This was not a lunch. This was a proceeding. I didn't realize this was a formal gathering, Damien said. It's not formal, Coretti said. We just need to know where things stand. Where things stand is that last night was an internal family matter and the response to it, the communications disruptions, the account freezes, is being addressed. How? Said Tao. One word. Tao was the youngest captain, 43, and ran 3 legitimate construction firms whose contracts happened to include the foundations of several buildings where things had been put that benefited from deep concrete above them. He was not a man given to elaboration. Through the appropriate channels, Damien said. The appropriate channels are what's broken, Halsey said. Halsey was the one with the judges and the customs deputy, the one who maintained the Varelli family's regulatory buffer with the specific skill of a man who understood that institutions could be both enemies and tools depending on where you place the pressure. His voice was precise and measured and entirely without warmth. I had a conversation this morning with Deputy Commissioner Teal's office. His assistant informed me that the Deputy Commissioner is unavailable indefinitely for consultations with private clients. Teal is navigable, Damien said. I don't think so, Halsey said, because I also spoke to the clerk in the Third Circuit who has been managing our docket arrangements for 6 years. He says he received a call last week from an attorney he described as representing a compliance review board. The call was a courtesy notification that the arrangement he had been operating under was under independent review. He paused. He has not taken my calls since. The room was very quiet. Last week, Damien said. Last week, Halsey confirmed. Before founding night, before the ceremony, before Damien had done anything. The compliance notification had gone out last week, which meant the machinery had been set in motion before the ballroom, before the necklace, before the ring on the table beside the champagne glass. Which meant she knew, Brennan said. Brennan was a big man, heavier than he looked at a distance, and he had a face that defaulted to a kind of resigned practicality that made him useful in difficult conversations. She set this up before the night. She wasn't reacting. She was already running it. Damien did not respond. I need to ask you something, Coretti said, and I need you to answer it straight. He leaned forward slightly. His hands were flat on the table. Did you know what she was holding? When you made the decision to do what you did last night, did you know what was built through her? The answer was no. The honest answer, the true answer, the answer that cost the most to give in a room full of men whose respect he had spent 30 years constructing, was no. He had known she was useful. He had known she handled the diplomatic side, the relationship maintenance, the particular social architecture of keeping everyone adjacent to the syndicate feeling seen and valued and included. He had categorized this as secondary work, important the way a housekeeper is important, essential to the comfort of the operation, replaceable if necessary, invisible by design. He had not known it was the foundation. He said, the situation is recoverable. Benedict Rowe, who had not spoken since greeting him, set both hands on the table and looked at Damien with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to recognize a specific kind of moment and had decided to name it rather than let it fester. Damien, Rowe said, I have been a neutral broker in this world for 31 years. I have seen families collapse. I have seen empires fold. I have seen men who were catastrophically wrong convince themselves that the problem was the messenger. He paused. He was not unkind. He was precise. What happened last night was not a domestic incident. You violated the founding tradition in front of every family that has ever extended trust to the Varelli name. The tradition exists for a reason. It is the one contract that sits above all others. The one that tells every allied partner that Varelli authority is bound by something larger than the ego of the man who holds it. He paused again. You demonstrated last night that it isn't. Rowe, I'm not finished. Quiet. Absolute. I received a message this morning, not from Serena directly, through a channel that I recognized as one she has used for years when communicating with neutral parties. The message informed me of a meeting. 3 days from now, a location is being arranged. Every major allied family has been invited. He looked at Damien steadily. You have not been. The table held that for a moment. A meeting, Damien said. A summit, Rose said, to discuss the future structure of the alliances currently in disruption. She doesn't have the authority. She has the relationships, Coretti said, and his voice had something in it that Damien had never heard from him before. Not contempt exactly, but the flat pragmatism of a man who has updated his assessment of a situation and is no longer performing loyalty to a position he no longer holds. That's what authority is in this world. That's what it has always been. Guns are how you take things. Relationships are how you keep them. He looked at the table and then back at Damien. She built the keeping for 11 years, and you. He stopped, edited himself. Last night happened. Damien sat very still in the chair at the head of the table and looked at the 5 men arranged around it, and performed, for their benefit, the expression of a man in control of a situation that was under management. He performed it with the same precision he had brought to every performance for 30 years. He performed it while something behind his sternum went cold and tight, and certain in a way that made all the noise in his head go quiet. He had 3 days. 3 days before a summit he had not been invited to, convened by a woman he had underestimated in every direction that mattered, would meet without him and decide the future of everything he had spent his life building. He needed to find her. He needed to find her before that meeting happened, and he needed to do it through channels that were not already compromised, which meant he needed to think about which parts of his operation existed outside the web Serena had built, which meant he needed to be honest with himself about whether any such parts existed at all. The men around the table were waiting. 3 days is enough time, Damien said. None of them agreed with him. He could see it in the way they held their faces, not hostile, not rebellious, but careful, the careful expression of men who have decided to wait and see and have stopped believing the outcome is the one the man at the head of the table is describing. He noted it. He filed it. He dismissed them with the same courtesy he had always used and watched them file out. And when Benedict Rowe was the last one at the door, Damien said his name, and Rowe turned. "The message you received," Damien said, "did it include a location for the summit?" Rowe looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "It didn't." He held the door. "Damien, I have watched you for 20 years. I watched your father before you. You are capable. You are not stupid." He paused once more. "But the woman you married is something I have not seen very often in this world. And I think, in 30 years of marriage to this business, you may have made the same mistake that most men in your position eventually make." "What mistake?" "You confused being powerful," Rowe said quietly, "with being the most important person in the room." He left. Damien sat alone at the table for the empty dining room of the Meridian Club and looked at the untouched water glasses and the closed menus and the 5 chairs that now held only the absence of the men who had sat in them, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived not like revelation, but like the slow confirmation of something his body had known since the moment he heard the silence in the ballroom, that he was not managing a crisis. He was already inside the consequence. And somewhere in a city he couldn't locate her in, Serena Vale was 3 days away from making that consequence permanent, unless he found a way to reach her through the wreckage of every bridge he had spent last night burning, through the collapsed infrastructure of 30 years of relationships that had turned out, in the final accounting, to belong not to him, but to the woman he had replaced with someone who looked better in red. He had one move left that she might not have accounted for. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not used in 4 years, a number connected to a man who owed him a debt that predated Serena, predated the syndicate's current form, predated everything she had built, a debt written in a currency that no diplomatic web could dissolve, because it was written in the one language that existed before relationships and after them, and underneath them all. The phone rang, and in a hotel room 200 miles north, Serena Vale's second phone lit up with an alert she had set 11 years ago, connected to a monitoring system she had built to track exactly this number. And she looked at the notification and felt the first thing she had permitted herself to feel since driving away from the Castello Nero in the dark. Not fear, not satisfaction, but the specific alertness of a chess player who has just watched her opponent make the move she had been waiting for him to make. The move that confirmed he was exactly as desperate as she needed him to be, and that the next 72 hours would determine whether everything she had spent 11 years building would hold against the one variable she had never been fully able to model. The thing Damien Varelli was willing to do when he had absolutely nothing left to lose. The number Damien called belonged to a man named Croft, not his real name. In 30 years of operating in the margins of the world that Damien Varelli owned, Croft had accumulated 4 verifiable identities and discarded 3 of them. And the name Croft was the one that had stuck, not because it was legal, but because it was the one that people who needed him knew to use. He was 61 years old. He had worked intelligence for a government he no longer named, and when that work ended, not cleanly, not voluntarily, he had taken the specific skill set that governments spend decades and enormous sums of money developing and had applied it to a private market that paid considerably better and asked considerably fewer questions about methodology. What Croft did was find people, not people who had simply left. Anyone could find those. Croft found people who had constructed their disappearance in advance, who had built the exit before they needed it, who understood that the difference between a person who vanishes and a person who is found lies entirely in the quality of the preparation. He found those people because he understood from the inside how that preparation was built, the logic of it, the architecture, the specific choices a careful person made when they were constructing an identity that could hold weight under pressure. Damien had used him once, 4 years ago, for a situation that had required finding someone before that someone reached a particular prosecutor's office. The situation had resolved. Croft had been paid. The debt Damien was now calling in was not financial. It was the other kind. The kind that predated money. The kind written in the specific currency of a favor, done at the precise moment when the alternative was catastrophic. Croft answered on the 4th ring. "It's been a while," Croft said. His voice was the same as Damien remembered. Unhurried, slightly dry, the voice of a man for whom urgency was a thing that happened to other people. "I need you to find someone," Damien said. "I heard about your evening." "Then you know the timeline." 3 days, Croft said, "to a meeting you haven't been invited to, in a location you don't have." A pause. "That's tight. Can you do it?" "I can do most things." Another pause, longer. "Who is it?" "My wife." The silence on the line had a different quality than the earlier silences of the morning. Not the silence of a man buying time or editing himself, but the silence of a man genuinely recalibrating. "Your wife," Croft said, "Serena Vale. She left the Castello Nero last night at approximately 23:40, private car, unregistered to any Varelli account. She had a prepared exit, bag, vehicle, route. This was planned in advance." "How far in advance?" "I don't know." "What do you know about her prep?" Damien thought about the offshore accounts, the signatory pages, the compliance notifications sent last week, the attorney letters drafted and held and released at the precise correct moment. "She's thorough," he said. "She's been building this for, I don't know how long, more than a year, possibly longer." "Prepared exits built over years don't leave the same footprints as panicked ones," Croft said. "She'll have layered it. Clean ID, clean vehicle chain, clean communication. The question is where the edges are. Everyone has edges. Find hers. I'll need access to everything. Phone records going back 3 years, financial records, travel logs, social contacts, staff communications, everything your system holds on her. You'll have it within the hour?" "And Damien," Croft's voice shifted slightly, not warmer but more direct. The tone of a man who considered honesty a professional tool. "The people at that summit, they're not waiting for you to find her. They're already in motion. Finding her is only useful if you know what you're going to do when you do." "I'll handle that." "Will you?" Croft: "I'm asking practically, not philosophically, because the last man I found for you, the one 4 years ago, you handled that situation with a methodology that closed the problem permanently. If that's the methodology you're considering here, it isn't," Damien said. A pause. "All right. I need her at a table. I need to talk to her before the summit." "Talk," Croft repeated, and the word had a specific flatness to it that suggested he was filing it without fully believing it. "Yes," Damien said. He ended the call. He sat for a moment in the private dining room of the Meridian Club with the empty chairs around him and the untouched table settings and the low light that the club maintained at all hours to create the impression that time inside its walls moved differently than it did on the street below. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. 200 miles north, Serena Vale was eating toast. This was not metaphorical. She was sitting at a small table in a rented room above a harbor town that the tourist industry had not yet discovered, and therefore still looked like a place where people actually lived. Weathered storefronts, boats with working engines rather than decorative ones. A diner 2 streets over that opened at 5 and closed at 2 and did not have a website. The room smelled of salt air and old wood. The window above the table looked out over a stretch of gray water that was being worked by the wind into low whitecaps. The toast was from a bread she'd bought the previous evening at a shop run by a woman who hadn't looked at her twice. She ate methodically. She was not hungry, but she had trained herself over 11 years to maintain physical routines under pressure because the body's requirements did not pause for crisis, and a body that was not maintained made errors that a maintained body did not make. Her second phone was on the table beside the toast. The alert she had set 4 years ago, triggered by any outgoing call from Damien's emergency line to a list of numbers she had compiled through a process she had spent 6 months constructing, had fired 47 minutes ago. She knew who he had called. She had known when she built the list that Croft would be on it, because Croft was the resource Damien reached for when all visible resources had failed, and he needed something done that operated outside the usual structure. She had accounted for Croft. What she had not accounted for, what she was sitting with now, alongside the toast and the gray water and the alert on her second phone, was the specific information that had arrived 11 minutes ago through a different channel. A message from a source she had cultivated for 3 years, embedded in the Castello Nero's household staff, at a level so unremarkable that no security sweep had ever flagged the connection. A woman named Petra, who cleaned the third-floor corridor, and who had, over 3 years, proven to have the observational precision of someone who understood that information was currency and had quietly been banking it. Petra's message was 8 words. He went to the East Wing archive room. Serena set down her toast. The East Wing archive room was not on the Castello Nero's official floor plan. It was a room that existed in the space between the 3rd floor and the roof structure, accessible through a panel in the back of a linen closet in the family's private corridor. Damien used it for documents that did not exist in any system. Physical paper, handwritten records, the kind of archive that predated digital infrastructure and had survived because some things were safer on paper in a hidden room than on a server that could be accessed by people with the right technical skills and the right motivation. Serena had known about the room for 9 years. She had accessed it twice, carefully, in Damien's absence, and had photographed what was in it and had placed those photographs in a location she considered secure. What concerned her was not that Damien had gone to the archive room. What concerned her was why and what he had gone to retrieve, and whether what was in that room represented a variable she had underweighted. She picked up her primary phone, a clean device, new SIM, purchased with cash in a city she had passed through 3 days before founding night, and made a call. It was answered on the second ring by a woman whose voice was low and unhurried and precise in the way of someone who had spent a career in rooms where imprecision had consequences. "Lena," Serena said. "I saw the alert," Lena said. "Croft." "Yes. How long to intercept his data request?" "His request to Varelli's systems?" "I'm already in. He submitted credentials 12 minutes ago." The sound of keys. "He's pulling 3 years of your communication records, travel logs, financial movement flagged to your name, and a pause. Staff correspondence archives." Serena's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "Staff correspondence. Full archive request? Everything routed through the Castello's internal communication system for the past 4 years." Serena was quiet for 3 seconds. She was doing what she always did when a new variable entered the calculation. Not reacting, but mapping, locating the new information inside the existing structure and identifying what it changed and what it didn't. Staff correspondence. 4 years. Petra had been communicating through the Castello's internal system for the early period of their arrangement. 18 months, approximately, before Serena had moved the channel to an external route that existed entirely outside any Varelli-connected infrastructure. 18 months of messages. Not explicit. Petra was careful, Serena had trained her to be careful, but readable, to someone who knew what they were reading, as a pattern, as a relationship, as a source. Can you corrupt the archive before he pulls it? Serena asked. I can corrupt it, Lena said. But a targeted corruption on a specific archive inside a live system pull is going to leave a mark. Croft will see that something was removed. He's good enough to know what that means. He'll know someone is monitoring his access. Yes. Serena considered this. Croft, knowing he was being monitored, changed his behavior. It also told him something about the sophistication of the operation he was working against, which would update his assessment of the timeline and the difficulty and potentially his fee negotiation with Damien. But more importantly, it would tell him that whoever he was looking for had built infrastructure capable of watching a man like Croft in real time, which was a different category of opponent than a domestic situation involving a wounded woman with resources. Leave it, she said. Leave it? Leave the archive intact. Let him pull it. She thought for a moment. But I need you to do something else. I need you to find out what Damien took out of the East Wing archive room in the last hour. A pause. I don't have eyes inside that room. No, but the room has a humidity sensor connected to the building management system, and the building management system logs every environmental reading with a timestamp. If he opened the room, the sensor activated. I need to know the timestamp and cross-reference it with the archive inventory I photographed in year 3. You have an inventory of a secret room, Lena said. I have an inventory of everything, Serena said. The answer came back in 40 minutes. She had moved by then, left the rented room, left the harbor town, was sitting in the passenger seat of a second car in a rest area off a highway that connected nothing of particular importance to nothing else of particular importance. And Lena's voice came through the phone with the slightly compressed quality of a secure line doing its work. Timestamp puts him in the room at 9:14 this morning, Lena said. 14 minutes. Based on your inventory photographs and cross-referencing the items by position in the room, another pause. He took the Caldwell correspondence. Serena did not react visibly. She was alone in the car. There was no one to perform composure for, but she sat very still and looked at the gray highway and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite the cold clarity she had been operating from since founding night, but something between them. The specific sensation of a person who has built a very careful structure and has just discovered that one of the load-bearing elements was not as secure as she had calculated. The Caldwell correspondence was a set of letters, physical letters, handwritten, 17 of them, that documented a negotiation conducted 12 years ago, 1 year before Serena married Damien Varelli, between Damien and a man named Arthur Caldwell, who had at the time been the chief financial officer of a neutral brokerage house. The negotiation had concerned the acquisition of a particular set of accounts that had belonged to a family called the Morvain, who had been in the process of dissolution. The Morvain dissolution had not been entirely natural. The letters documented Damien's role in accelerating it, and more specifically, they documented his use of a woman, unnamed in the letters but identifiable through the specific context, who had been positioned inside the Morvain household as a trusted associate and had provided information that had allowed Damien to dismantle their alliances from the inside before they understood what was happening. The unnamed woman in the Caldwell correspondence was Serena Vale. Before she was Serena Varelli. Before the marriage. Before the 11 years, she had been 27 years old. She had been working for Damien in a capacity she had told herself was temporary, was transitional, was a necessary passage through a world she intended to move beyond. She had done what he had asked her to do. She had been very good at it. And when the Morvain family had collapsed and the accounts had transferred and the business had concluded, Damien had sat across from her at a dinner table and said, with the particular precision of a man who understood leverage in all its forms, "You're too good at this to waste on one job, and now we both know what you're capable of." 6 months later, he had proposed. She had accepted. And she had told herself, had constructed an entire architecture of self-justification around the telling that what she had done to the Morvains was a thing that belonged to a previous version of herself, a version that the marriage and the role and the 11 years of building something real and functional and valuable had superseded. She had told herself this so many times and with such consistency that it had become, in the way that repeated things do, something that felt true. The Caldwell letters were the proof that it wasn't. And if Damien brought those letters to the summit, to the room full of allied bosses and independent brokers and neutral families who were currently deciding the future of the underworld's architecture, and presented them as evidence of what Serena Vale had done before she was Donna Virelli, before she was the wronged woman who had walked out of a ballroom with her dignity intact, before she was the architect of a diplomatic web that these men had trusted with their most sensitive agreements. She pressed her thumb against the center of her palm, hard enough to feel the pressure but not the pain, a grounding technique she had learned in a different life and never fully discarded. He wasn't going to use the letters to destroy her personally. She understood that. The letters were not a weapon for public use, they were a weapon for private use, for a room, for the specific conversation that happened between two people when one of them was trying to negotiate from an impossible position. He was going to use them to get to the table, to get her to meet him before the summit, one-on-one, in a room where he could look at her and say, "Come back, or I show everyone what you are." The negotiation he thought he was going to have. She had 48 hours before the summit. She needed to make 3 calls. The first was to a man named Garrett, who was currently serving as the primary convener of the summit arrangements, a neutral party who had been chosen by collective agreement of the allied families because his independence was documented and his self-interest was entirely aligned with the stability of the arrangements that the summit was designed to protect. She needed to tell Garrett that a piece of information was about to surface, and she needed to tell him first, before Damien used it, because the difference between a revelation and a confession was entirely a matter of who spoke first. The second call was to Lena, to set in motion a process she had constructed years ago and hoped never to use, a counter-archive, a documentation of the full Morvain situation that included context the Caldwell letters did not contain, context that Damien did not know she had, context that changed the moral geometry of what she had done in a way that was not exculpatory but was considerably more complex than the version the letters alone would tell. The third call she didn't make immediately. The third call was to Petra. Because Petra's message had said that Damien went to the East Wing archive room. It had not said he was alone. And Serena had just realized, sitting in the car on the gray highway with the pressure of her thumb still fading from her palm, that she had not asked who he had brought with him. She dialed Petra. Petra answered in the careful way she always answered. No greeting, just presence, the sound of someone who had learned to communicate in the space between words. The archive room, Serena said. Was he alone? A pause that lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was too long for a simple yes. He had someone with him, Petra said. I couldn't see who. The corridor camera covers the linen closet from a partial angle. I saw 2 people go in. Description. The second person was smaller, not one of his security, not a captain. Another pause. I think it was a woman. Serena's mind ran through the list. Not Celeste. Celeste didn't have access and wouldn't have known about the room. Not household staff. Not legal representation. A woman who was with Damien at 9 in the morning, in a secret room that Damien had gone to specifically to retrieve a document about Serena. Did you see her come in? Serena asked. What time? She was already in the Castello when I came on shift at 6, Petra said. I think she arrived during the night. She went straight to Damien's private corridor. Security cleared her without logging her. I checked the entry system this morning. Without logging her. Which meant Rourke had cleared her manually, bypassing the entry record, which was a procedure used in exactly 2 circumstances. When Damien didn't want a record of a visitor, and when the visitor had the specific standing to request it. Petra? Serena said carefully. Did you see her face? Any detail? Hair, build, anything? Gray hair, Petra said. Short. She walked like someone who doesn't think about how she walks, like it's never occurred to her that someone might be watching. Serena closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She knew who that was. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She was 64 years old. She had been Damien's father's consigliere. Not officially, not in any document, but functionally, operationally, in the way that certain people exist inside institutions as the actual architecture, while everyone visible is merely the facade. Eleanor Voss had retired from active involvement in Virelli affairs 8 years ago, or had appeared to. Serena had never been fully convinced of the retirement because Eleanor Voss was the kind of person for whom retirement was not a state of being, but a posture. Something you adopted when active visibility was no longer advantageous and quiet influence was more efficient. Serena had studied Eleanor Voss in the first year of the marriage and had arrived at a conclusion she had maintained ever since. Eleanor was the one person in the Virelli world who might be capable of building a counter-strategy to whatever Serena constructed, because Eleanor had been doing this longer, had done it for a different generation, and had the specific advantage of being entirely invisible to people who were looking at Damien. Eleanor Voss being in the Castello. Eleanor Voss being in the archive room with Damien. Eleanor Voss, who had been Damien's father's most trusted mind, and who had therefore almost certainly known about the Caldwell correspondence, had possibly been involved in it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. Croft's data pool is complete. He has the staff archive. 18 months of early Petra correspondence. Serena. He's going to find the channel. Serena stared at the message. Croft would find Petra. He would find the channel. He would tell Damien. Damien would tell Eleanor, and Eleanor would understand exactly what it meant. Not just that Serena had an informant in the household, but that the informant had sent the message that morning about the archive room, which meant Serena now knew about the Caldwell letters, which meant the leverage Damien thought he was holding had already been identified and was being countered, which meant Eleanor would advise him to move faster than the summit, to use the letters now, publicly, before Serena could construct the counter-narrative. She made the call to Garrett. He answered on the first ring. "I've been expecting to hear from you," he said. "We need to move the summit," Serena said. 24 hours forward. That's... She could hear him processing it. That's tomorrow night. Yes. Half the attendees are still in transit. They have phones, Serena said. Call them. Tell them the timeline moved. Don't tell them why. Serena. His voice had the particular quality of a man who was used to facilitating other people's decisions and was trying to determine if this particular decision was his to facilitate. What's happening? Is the summit compromised? Not yet, she said. But there's a variable I didn't fully account for. Someone I didn't... She stopped. The sentence had an ending she wasn't prepared to say out loud. Not because it was untrue, but because saying it to Garrett would be the first time she had admitted it to anyone. An admission had a weight to it. Someone I underestimated, she said. I need 24 hours less than I thought I had. I'll make the calls, Garrett said. She ended the call and sat in the car and tried to think about Eleanor Voss with the same cold precision she had applied to everything else in the past 60 hours, and found that the cold precision kept encountering something that impeded it, something that felt like the specific discomfort of a person confronting a mirror they had deliberately avoided. Eleanor Voss was what Serena Vale had been built from. Not literally, not through direct instruction, but in the way that people are shaped by the architecture of the world they enter when they are young and flexible and paying attention. When Serena had first come into Damien's orbit at 26, Eleanor Voss had been the standard she had measured herself against without acknowledging she was measuring. The patience, the invisibility, the construction of influence through relationship rather than position, the understanding that the most powerful person in a room is often the one who appears to hold no power at all. These were things Serena had learned by watching Eleanor, and then had spent 11 years convincing herself she had invented independently. Eleanor had taught her, without knowing she was teaching her, everything she had used to build the apparatus that was now in the process of dismantling Damien Virelli's empire. And Eleanor apparently had been watching. Serena's second phone buzzed. Not an alert this time. A call. From a number she did not recognize, but that carried a prefix she knew. A routing prefix used by exactly one class of person. The class of person who used communication infrastructure that existed specifically outside any architecture Serena might have built to monitor it. She answered. You should have accounted for me, Eleanor Voss said. Her voice was the same as Serena remembered, dry, unhurried, with the specific economy of someone who had never in her life wasted a word. That's the only real mistake you made. Serena's hand was steady on the phone. Her voice, when she spoke, was equally steady. How long have you known? That you were building something? A pause. Since year 4. You got better at hiding it after that. But the early architecture left marks. Another pause. You learned well. I'm not being condescending. I mean that with the specific respect of someone who recognizes their own methods. What do you want, Eleanor? The same thing you want, Eleanor said. For this to end in a way that doesn't destroy every structure that took 40 years to build. Damien is finished? I know that. I've known it since midnight on founding night. I'm not here to save him. A pause. I'm here because what you've built is impressive and fragile, and you're about to lose it. I moved the summit. I know, I heard. Something that might have been a dry sound of amusement. That buys you time. It doesn't change what Damien is going to do with those letters once Croft finds your informant and Eleanor tells him you've already seen the play. She paused. He won't negotiate with them anymore. He'll use them. He'll destroy himself using them. The context takes time to establish, Eleanor said. And these men don't wait for context. You know that. You've spent 11 years knowing that. The first story is the one that lands. Damien puts those letters in front of Benedict Rowe tonight, and the summit tomorrow becomes a conversation about whether the woman who arranged it was running the same operation on all of them that she ran on the Morvans. And it doesn't matter how good your counter-documentation is, because the question is already in the room. Serena said nothing, because Eleanor was right. Because Eleanor had spent 30 more years than Serena understanding how rooms of men like these operated, and the specific mechanics of reputation damage, and the way a question, once planted, did not require proof to do its work. What are you proposing? Serena said. A meeting, Eleanor said. Tonight, before Croft finishes his work. Before Damien makes a decision about the letters. A pause. Not a negotiation. An exchange of information. I have something you need, and you have something the situation needs, and neither of those things are available anywhere else. Why would you help me? The question landed, and Eleanor let it sit for a moment before answering, and in the space of that pause, Serena heard something she had not expected to hear from this woman. In this conversation, at this stage of what was happening, something that sounded very faintly and under considerable compression like exhaustion. Because I built the first version of what you built, Eleanor said, 40 years ago, for Damien's father. Because I watched what it costs, and because I watched what happens when the women who build these things are erased from them. Not by enemies, not by rivals, but by the men they built them for. Her voice did not change in timbre. The exhaustion was in the pacing, not the tone. I didn't fight it when it happened to me. I told myself it was strategic, that I was choosing the long game. A pause. I watched you the whole time you were building yours, and I thought, she's doing it right. She'll get out clean. Another pause. And then I watched Founding Night, and I thought, not if Damien gets to those letters first. Serena looked at the gray highway through the windshield. The wind was pushing debris across the asphalt, leaves, a plastic bag, the small detritus of movement. She thought about being 27 years old in a room with the Morvagnes, performing trust she did not feel, extracting information from people who believed she was their ally. She thought about the version of herself that had done that, and the version of herself that had spent 11 years building something real on top of the foundation of what that first version had done. She thought about whether the second version absolved the first or simply stood on it. Where? She said. There's a restaurant, Eleanor said, and named a city that was equidistant between Serena's current location and the Castello Nero, which meant Eleanor knew approximately where Serena was, which meant Eleanor had resources Serena had not mapped, which meant this meeting carried a level of exposure Serena was going to have to accept because the alternative was arriving at the summit tomorrow with a weapon aimed at her back that she couldn't see. 8 o'clock, Serena said. 8 o'clock, Eleanor confirmed. And then, before she ended the call, Serena, the letters aren't the worst of it. Serena's hand tightened on the phone. What's worse than the letters? What's in the room with the letters? Eleanor said. What I didn't tell Damien I found when I was looking through the archive with him this morning. A pause that had a different weight than the others, Not strategic, not measured, but the pause of a person about to hand something over that cannot be taken back. There's a second set of documents, not Caldwell, older, from before your arrangement with Damien, before the Morvanes, from when you were 24 years old and working for a man named Dresch in the Eastern Corridor. A pause. Documents that explain why Dresch's operation collapsed, and who provided the information that collapsed it. The pause was absolute. And who that information was provided to. Serena stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds, because the name Eleanor had just said, Dresch, connected to a thread that Serena had believed was not a thread at all, but a sealed room, a closed chapter, a thing that had happened when she was 24 and frightened and operating in a world she did not yet understand with the tools she had, and not the tools she would eventually build. A thing that had remained sealed for 17 years because the only people who had known about it were Dresch himself, who was dead, and the person she had provided the information to, who was 8 o'clock, Eleanor said again, and the line went dead. Serena sat in the car with the dead phone against her ear and felt the specific sensation of a person who has spent 11 years building a structure designed to withstand every conceivable pressure and has just discovered that the ground it was built on was never as solid as she had measured it to be, and that the person who knows exactly where the fault lines run is waiting for her in a restaurant at 8 o'clock, holding documents that could not just end the summit, but could end everything. And the only question that remained, the only question that mattered now, in the 40 seconds since Eleanor's voice had gone silent, was whether Eleanor Voss was offering her a way out or walking her into the one trap she had never thought to build a contingency for. The restaurant was called Anselm's. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a textile warehouse in a previous century and had retained the bones of that function. Exposed brick, ceiling beams that ran the length of the room at a height that made the space feel both vast and contained. Windows along the street-facing wall that had been replaced at some point with glass thick enough to muffle the city outside into something that sounded like weather. It was the kind of place that attracted people who needed to have conversations in public without being heard, which meant it attracted a specific clientele, which meant the staff had the particular professional and curiosity of people who had learned that noticing things was not part of the job description. Serena arrived at 7:43. She had changed cars twice since Eleanor's call and had spent the intervening hours doing 2 things simultaneously: running the calculation on Eleanor Voss with every piece of information she possessed about the woman, and trying to locate the Dresch documents in her own memory with the specific urgency of someone searching a room in the dark, knowing what she's looking for, not knowing which wall it's behind. The Dresch situation was 17 years old. She had been 24. She had been working courier routes in the Eastern Corridor for a man named Dresch, who ran a distribution network that was, on its surface, a legitimate freight operation, and was, beneath the surface, the primary supply channel for 3 connected criminal organizations who used its infrastructure to move things that freight manifests did not describe. She had worked for Dresch for 8 months. She had been good at it. She had also been, at 24, still in the process of understanding what world she had entered and what its rules were, and what happened to people who applied the wrong ones. What happened to Dresch's operation was this: it collapsed. In the space of 6 weeks, 3 separate interdiction operations hit 3 separate nodes of the distribution network with the kind of precision that suggested the operations were coordinated, and the coordinators had inside information. Dresch had lost the network, lost the clients, and lost, eventually, his freedom. He had died in custody 4 years later of causes that the official record described as natural and that people who knew the Eastern Corridor described differently. Serena had provided the information that collapsed it. She had done so because she had been approached by a man who presented credentials she had, at 24 believed were governmental, who had told her that Dresch's network was being used to move materials that were going to get people killed, and who had offered her protection and a clean exit if she cooperated. She had cooperated. The protection had materialized. The clean exit had materialized. The man with the credentials had disappeared, and she had moved forward. And she had not looked back, because looking back at that age at the things you had done in order to survive was a mechanism for paralysis that she had decided she could not afford. The man with the credentials. She had known his name. She had not, in 17 years, spoken it to anyone. His name was Garrett. The same Garrett who is currently convening the summit. The same Garrett whose independence and neutrality had been collectively agreed upon by every allied family as the foundation on which the summit's legitimacy rested. The same Garrett she had called 3 hours ago to move the timeline 24 hours forward. She understood now what Eleanor had meant. The letters weren't the worst of it. The Dresch documents weren't even the worst of it. The worst of it was the thread that connected them. A thread that, if pulled in the right room by the right person, would not simply raise questions about Serena's past, but would detonate the summit itself, because a summit convened by a man with a 17-year relationship with one of its primary architects was not a neutral proceeding. It was a controlled outcome, and every family in that room would see it that way. She ordered water. She sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door and waited. Eleanor Voss walked in at 8:02. In person, she was smaller than Serena's memory held her, not physically diminished, not aged in any way that suggested weakness, but compact in the way of things that have been refined over time into their most essential form. She wore a gray coat. Her hair was short and white, and she wore it without self-consciousness, the way people wear things they stopped thinking about years ago. She moved through the restaurant without looking at the other tables, which was either the carelessness of a woman who felt no threat or the discipline of one who had already assessed the room before entering and had nothing left to check. She sat across from Serena without preamble. "You know about Garrett," Serena said. Not a question. "I've known about Garrett for 6 years," Eleanor said, "since I started watching you properly." She folded her hands on the table. Her hands were the oldest thing about her. The skin thin over the knuckles, the joints slightly enlarged, but the stillness of them absolute. He was a good choice for the summit convener, genuinely neutral to everyone in that room except you. The kind of neutral that's invisible because it's real in all the directions anyone thinks to check. A pause. Until the Dresch documents make it not. Where are the documents? In the archive room, still. Eleanor looked at her steadily. Damien doesn't know they exist. He went to retrieve the Caldwell letters, and I went with him to ensure he didn't find anything else. I found the Dresch file in the adjacent box. He was focused on Caldwell. I palmed the file. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and placed a manila envelope on the table between them. "This is everything." Serena did not touch it immediately. "Why?" "Because I told you why on the phone." "You told me why you're not saving Damien. You didn't tell me why you're handing me a document that could be used against me." Eleanor's expression did not change. "I'm handing it to you because it's yours to manage. What you did at 24 is your business. The problem isn't the content of the file. You can contextualize that. You have the counter documentation. And frankly, the families at that summit have done considerably worse at considerably older ages. The problem is Garrett." She paused. "You need to remove him as convener before the summit opens tomorrow." "If I remove Garrett 24 hours before the summit, it raises questions." "Yes." "It destabilizes the proceedings before they begin." "Yes." Eleanor's voice did not shift. "But a summit that begins with a compromised convener and discovers it midway through is considerably more destabilized. You know how those rooms work. Suspicion, once it lands, doesn't lift." She looked at Serena with the specific directness of someone delivering a dose they know is unpleasant and are not going to pretend otherwise. "You have to replace him tonight." "With whom?" "With me." The table held that for a long moment. "You," Serena said. "I'm the only person in this situation who is genuinely neutral," Eleanor said. "I have no stake in the outcome. Damien is finished, and I have made my peace with that. I have no alliances with any of the attending families that constitute a conflict. I have a 30-year record in this world that every person in that room can verify." She paused. "And I am the person who found the Dresch file and chose to bring it here rather than to Damien." "That last point," Serena said, "is not a credential. That's a demonstration that you're capable of making strategic decisions about what to reveal and when, which is exactly the quality that makes a biased convener dangerous." Eleanor looked at her. Something moved in her expression. Not offense, not amusement exactly, but the specific response of a person who has been accurately assessed and is acknowledging it. "Fair," she said. "Then consider this. I'm offering you the convener role with the full disclosure of everything I know about both you and the situation in front of whatever verification process you want to propose to the assembled families. Full transparency about my history with the Virelli organization, my history with Damien, and my decision to be here tonight. She paused. I am the only person offering you anything in this situation who is doing it in the open. Serena picked up the manila envelope. She did not open it. She held it and thought about Garrett, and about the 18-year-old choice she had made at 24, and about the way that choices made young had a specific half-life. They decayed slowly, but they did not decay completely. And at the moment of maximum pressure, they reconstituted themselves with an intensity that was proportional to how long you had spent not looking at them. I need to make a call, she said. I know, Eleanor said. Garrett. Yes. He's just going to deny it, Eleanor said. He's going to say the Dresch situation was a one-time operational necessity and that it has no bearing on his independence as a convener. And he won't be entirely wrong, but he'll also be asking you to take that on faith in front of a room full of men who do not operate on faith. She paused. And you'll be asking them to take it too. Serena stood. Give me 10 minutes. She walked to the back of the restaurant, past the kitchen entrance, through a door that opened into a narrow service corridor that smelled of cooking oil and cold stone. She called Garrett. He answered on the first ring, same as always, and she heard in that immediate answer the quality she had always read as reliability and was now reading as something more complicated. The attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for this call, who had known since 8 o'clock that something had shifted, who had perhaps known longer than that. Serena. His voice was even. Dresch, she said. A silence. 4 seconds. 5. Serena. Don't, she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended, with an edge she hadn't planned. Don't build the sentence. I don't have time for the sentence. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the service corridor and kept her voice down and felt her heartbeat in her throat. I need to know one thing. The documents in the Virelli East Wing archive, did you know they existed? Another silence, shorter this time. I knew Dresch kept records. That's not what I asked. Yes, Garrett said. I knew. The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped into water. Not explosive, not dramatic, but the kind of impact that sent rings outward in every direction and kept going. For how long? 3 years. I found out through a secondary channel that the records had been acquired by the Virelli archive at some point in the early years of your marriage. I don't know how Damien got them. And you didn't tell me. No? Why? The pause this time had a different quality. Not defensive, not strategic, but the pause of a man who had spent 3 years constructing a justification and was now finding it inadequate in the actual moment of use. Because telling you would have required explaining how I knew, and explaining how I knew would have required explaining what I was 17 years ago when I approached you, which would have ended this, Serena said. Whatever this is, whatever arrangement we've been operating inside for 11 years. Yes, Garrett said quietly. Are you independent, Garrett? She asked it straight without inflection, the way you ask a question when you already know the answer and are giving someone the space to confirm it anyway. As a convener, as the man every family in that room agreed to trust. Are you independent? Another silence, the longest one. Not entirely, he said. No. She ended the call. She stood in the service corridor for 10 seconds. The kitchen noise on the other side of the wall was steady and indifferent. The clatter of professional work, heat and pressure, and the rhythm of things that needed doing. She thought about 11 years of building. She thought about founding night and the weight of the necklace leaving her throat and the click of her ring against the table. She thought about 24-year-old Serena Vale in the Eastern Corridor, frightened and capable in making the decision she made. Then she went back to the table and sat down across from Eleanor Voss and said, How do we do this? They worked until midnight. Eleanor had, in the bag she'd brought, a plain leather bag, old, the kind that had stopped looking expensive 20 years ago and had become simply functional. A set of printed contact dossiers for every attendee at the summit. Not social profiles. Operational profiles. Known priorities, current vulnerabilities, the specific pressure each person was under, and what outcome they needed from the summit to relieve it. She had compiled these, she said without elaborating, over the course of the past 3 days. You started this the night of founding night, Serena said, looking at the dossiers. I started preparing for this the week before founding night, Eleanor said. When Damien told me what he was planning, Serena looked up from the documents. He told you. He told me he was going to make a change at the ceremony. He didn't tell me the specifics. Eleanor's hands were flat on the table. I told him it was a mistake. He told me I was being sentimental. A pause. We have a long history of him ignoring my counsel and being subsequently surprised by the consequences. Why didn't you warn me? Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Because I didn't know you yet, she said. Not fully. I knew what you had built. I didn't know why you had built it. The why matters. She paused. Now I know the why, and it changes what I think the right outcome is. They went through the dossiers one by one. Serena took notes on a legal pad in handwriting that was small and precise and contained no words that would mean anything to someone who found the pad without the context. Eleanor talked. She talked the way someone talks when they have been holding knowledge for a long time and have finally found the correct recipient. Not with relief exactly, but with the specific fluency of a person using the right tool for the first time after years of making do with the wrong one. By 10:30, they had a replacement convening structure. By 11, they had a disclosure protocol for the Garrett situation, a pre-summit acknowledgement of the conflict, framed as a demonstration of the summit's commitment to transparency, presented by Eleanor in her opening statement before any family had time to raise it as a question. By 11:45, they had worked through the Caldwell letters and the Dresch documents, and arrived at the counter-presentation that Serena would make if Damien found a way into the room and deployed them. At midnight, Eleanor said, "There's one more thing." Serena waited. "Damien is going to be at the Opera House," Eleanor said. "He's arranged it. He's calling it a summit of his own, reaching out tonight to every family, positioning it as a counter-proceeding, claiming that the summit you've arranged is illegitimate because the convener has a conflict." She paused. "Rourke told him about Garrett 40 minutes ago." Serena's pen stopped moving. "How does Rourke know about Garrett?" "Because Croft found a secondary thread in the staff archive, not Petra's channel. A different one. A communication from 3 years ago between Garrett and a member of your logistics team. It was buried well, not well enough." Eleanor's voice was level. "Damien will have it by morning. He's going to use it to discredit the summit before it opens. And he's going to be physically present at the Opera House with his remaining security, positioning himself as the legitimate authority calling for order." She paused. "He will have the Caldwell letters with him. If you don't appear, he reads them to whoever shows up." Serena looked at the legal pad. Her handwriting looked back at her, small and precise and arranged, and she thought about the distance between the arrangement on paper and the room she was going to have to walk into tomorrow. The Opera House, Damien's security, the letters. Every calculation she had made for 11 years converging in a single room where the only currency was presence, was the willingness to stand in the center of it and not move. "He wants me there," she said. "Yes. He thinks he can negotiate in that room." "He thinks he can control the frame in that room," Eleanor said. "Which is different. He's not trying to get you back. He's trying to establish that the question of legitimacy is still open, that the families haven't made a decision, that there's still a Varelli authority structure worth convening around, even if its composition has changed." She paused. "He needs you present because your presence makes the question live. If you don't appear, the families make their decision without him. If you do appear, he gets to perform the contest." "So I don't go," Serena said. "If you don't go," Eleanor said carefully, "he reads the Caldwell letters to whoever does appear. And those men, even the ones who are committed to the summit, even the ones who have already decided, go into that room with a question in their heads, and questions in those heads at the wrong moment. Change outcomes," Serena said. "Yes." Serena stood up. She walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, late enough that the city had settled into its overnight register, the particular urban hush that was not silence but the absence of urgency. She looked at her own reflection in the thick glass and thought about the specific architecture of the trap she was standing inside. Go to the opera house. Damien gets the stage. Don't go. The letters land without answer. Either way, he had something. Unless. She turned back to the table. The summit is tomorrow night, she said. What time does Damien plan to be at the opera house? He's called it for 4 p.m, Eleanor said, to get ahead of the evening summit. So there are 4 hours between his proceeding and ours. Yes. Can you be at the opera house at 4? Eleanor looked at her. In what capacity? In the capacity of someone who walks into that room before Damien opens it, Serena said, and tells every man in there that the convener of the legitimate summit has arrived and is prepared to begin early. She held Eleanor's eyes. Can you do that? I can do that, Eleanor said, but Damien has security. He will not permit. His security, Serena said, is comprised of men whose loyalty we have not yet tested under the specific pressure of having to choose between their employer and their employer's complete institutional collapse. She paused. I need you to make 3 calls tonight, not to the attendees, to Rourke. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You think Rourke will cross? I think Rourke has been working for a man for 8 years and understands more clearly than anyone in Damien's orbit exactly what the last 72 hours mean for the durability of that employment. She paused. He's practical. He always has been. Give him a practical alternative. Eleanor looked at her with the expression she had been wearing intermittently throughout the night, the expression that Serena had, over the past 4 hours, come to read as something specific, the expression of a person watching something they built in a different form, operated by different hands, and finding it both familiar and strange. You know, Eleanor said, when I was watching you build this for those 11 years, I kept trying to identify the thing you were doing that I hadn't done, the thing that made it different. She paused. I think it's this. I always treated the men around me as obstacles or instruments. You treat them as people who have their own calculations, and you build for those calculations. I learned it from watching you, Serena said. No, Eleanor said. You improved on it. That's different. She picked up her phone. I'll call Rourke. The opera house was called the Aldenmore. It had been closed for 11 years, not condemned, not demolished, but suspended in the particular limbo of a building whose restoration budget had been promised and never delivered, whose ownership had passed through 3 institutional hands without any of them committing to the cost of bringing it back. The interior had the specific quality of abandoned grandeur. The velvet of the seatbacks faded to a uniform dusty rose. The gilt on the balcony railings gone dark. The stage curtain hanging at an angle that suggested one of its rigging points had failed and no one had come to fix it. The acoustics were still perfect. The bones of the room were intact. It smelled of old fabric and cold stone and the specific odor of a space that had been waiting. Serena arrived at 3:47. She came through the scene dock entrance on the south side of the building, through a door that Rourke had confirmed would be unlocked, and she moved through the backstage labyrinth, ropes and counterweights, and the massive dark geometries of fly systems that hadn't moved in a decade, until she found the stage right wing, and from there she could see the auditorium. Damien was already there. He stood in the center of the stage, in the space where the curtain's failed rigging left a gap, and the light coming through the Aldenmore's high windows, the last of the afternoon light, the low, angled kind that came in gold and went fast, caught him in a way that was almost cinematic, the kind of lighting that belonged to a different kind of story than the one this had turned out to be. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent 30 years at the center of rooms and could not yet fully register that the room had changed. His security was there. 6 men positioned in the auditorium and at the entrances. Rourke was not among them, which confirmed what Eleanor had called to tell her 40 minutes ago. Rourke had listened, and Rourke had made his calculation, and Rourke was no longer in the building. The attendees were filing in. Not all of them. 4 of the families had declined Damien's counter summit entirely, sending no representative, which was its own statement. But 8 men were taking seats in the front rows of the auditorium, and among them Serena could see Coretti, whose presence surprised her, and Halza, whose presence did not, and two men she recognized from allied families who had not been at founding night, but whose presence at any proceeding involving the Virelli name carried weight, and Benedict Rowe in the third row. Still, Serena watched Damien scan the room and understood what he was counting: bodies. He was counting whether he had enough, whether the 8 men in the seats plus the letters in the leather portfolio under his arm constituted enough of a counterweight to the summit happening 4 hours from now to matter. His face was doing the calculation in real time, the way faces do when the person behind them has stopped performing and is just thinking, and what she saw in it was not confidence and was not desperation, but was the thing between them. The expression of a man who knows the odds have shifted against him and is preparing to play anyway because playing is the only option that is not surrender. She stepped out of the wing and onto the stage. The sound her footsteps made on the old boards was different from marble, warmer, denser, the sound of wood that had absorbed a century of performance and was performing still. She walked to center stage and stopped 8 feet from Damien and looked at him across the distance. The room went completely quiet. He looked at her. He had not known she was coming. She could see it in the single second of genuine reaction before his face reassembled, the quick tension across his jaw, the slight adjustment of his weight. He had expected her absence. He had prepared his opening for her absence. He was recalibrating at speed the way he always had, the particular cognitive quickness that had kept him alive for 30 years and that she had spent 11 years learning to account for. "Serena," he said. "Damien." His hand moved to the portfolio under his arm, not opening it, just the touch of it, a man reassuring himself that the weapon is still there. She noticed it. He noticed that she noticed it. That exchange happened in approximately 1 second and contained more information than the next 3 minutes of conversation would. "You came," he said. "I came," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I know." She looked at the 8 men in the seats and then back at him. That was the point. A pause. "I have the Caldwell correspondence," he said. "I know. If I read it in this room, you'll read it," she said. "Or you won't. That's your choice." Her voice was steady. She was aware of her heartbeat, not racing, but present, the specific elevated rhythm of a body that knows it is in the room where things are decided. "Before you decide, I want to tell you what happens either way. If you read it, you spend the next 4 hours managing questions about a 12-year-old document that everyone in this room will need to contextualize, which means calling people, checking records, making calls they don't want to make before a summit they're already planning to attend. You arrive at the Aldenmore tonight having fired the one piece of leverage you had in front of 8 men, 4 of whom will be at my summit in 4 hours. She paused. Or you don't read it. You talk to me. In this room. In front of witnesses. She paused again. Which is what you actually want. Damien's jaw was set hard. What I want, he said, and his voice had the compression in it, the low compressed pressure she knew meant the anger was at maximum and the control was at minimum, is for 3 nights ago to not have happened. It happened, she said. I know it happened. He took a step toward her. 1 step. Not aggressive, not territorial, but the involuntary step of a man whose body has moved before his strategy caught up. I know what I did. I know what it cost. I've been... He stopped. He looked at the portfolio in his hand. He looked up. You knew. Before the night, you had already set it in motion. Yes. How long? Long enough? How long, Serena? She looked at him. They were 6 feet apart now, and the light was going gold through the Aldenmore's high windows, and in it she could see the version of him she had first encountered 30 years ago. The younger architecture of the face, the particular energy of a man who had not yet fully hardened into what he had become, and she understood that she was not impervious to that version, that it occupied space inside her that was adjacent to grief, and she kept it there and did not act on it. 3 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years. Yes. The contingency, the accounts, the agreements. Yes. All of it. Yes. He turned away. He walked 4 steps toward the edge of the stage and stopped with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the quality of tension in them, the specific physical signature of a man absorbing something that is too large to absorb quickly. Then he turned back. "The Dresch file," he said. "You know I have it." "I know you don't have it," she said. "Not anymore." He stared at her. "Eleanor," she said simply. The name landed in his face like a physical thing, the specific impact of a betrayal by someone he had trusted absolutely, which Serena understood was a different category of impact than any other kind, because it did not just damage the relationship, but retroactively recontextualized every moment of it. She watched him process it, and did not feel satisfaction, and did not feel pity, but felt the clean, exhausted clarity of a person who has been running a very long race, and can see the finish line and knows the finish line is still going to hurt. "She's at the summit," Serena said. "As what?" "Convener." His laugh was short and had nothing of humor in it. "Of course she is." He looked at the ceiling. The Aldenmoor's painted ceiling, its figures faded almost to abstraction, reaching for things that were no longer clearly visible. "You turned my father's consigliere." "She turned herself," Serena said. "I just gave her a reason." He looked back down. He looked at the 8 men in the seats, who had been sitting in the specific stillness of people watching something that is above their pay grade to interrupt. And then he looked at Serena, and in his face now was the thing she had been waiting to see. Not defeat, which was a performance, but the end of performance, the thing underneath it, which was just a man in a room reckoning with the specific arithmetic of his own choices. "What do you want?" he said. Quiet, direct, the way he'd spoken to her years ago, before the roles had calcified. "Accountability," she said. "In front of this room and the summit tonight, a formal acknowledgement that the authority of the Virelli name was abused, that the traditions that held this world together were violated not by accident, but by choice." She paused. "And your withdrawal, voluntary, on record. And if I don't?" "The summit proceeds without your cooperation," she said. "Eleanor reads the full history of your leadership into the record, the decisions, the violations, the methodology, with documentation. Every family in that room makes their judgment with full information." She paused. "The outcome will be the same. The only difference is whether you choose it or it's chosen for you." He looked at the portfolio in his hand for a long time. Then he looked up, and Serena saw it. The precise moment when a man stops fighting the tide and starts figuring out how to reach the shore. And she held his gaze and did not blink and did not breathe, and waited for him to say the thing that would determine whether the next 4 hours were a proceeding or a war. And the room held its breath with her, 8 men in faded velvet seats and the dusty gold light, and the silence of a building that had been waiting 11 years for something worth witnessing. And Damien Virelli opened his mouth. Damien said, "I want a condition." The word landed in the quiet of the Aldenmoor the way single words land when the room has been stripped of everything except what matters. Clean, final, the sound of a man who has let go of the performance and is now speaking from whatever is underneath it. Serena waited. "The Caldwell letters," he said, "and the Dresch file. Whatever Eleanor has. Whatever you have." He looked at her steadily. "They don't enter the record. They don't get read into any proceeding. They stay out of the room tonight." He paused. "That's the condition." She looked at him. Behind her, she was aware of the 8 men in the seats, of the quality of their attention, the particular held stillness of people who understand they are witnessing a negotiation that will determine the shape of the next decade of their professional lives, and who have the sense not to disturb it. She was aware of the failing light through the high windows, gold going to amber, the day running out. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had steadied somewhere in the past 3 minutes into something that felt less like adrenaline and more like the rhythm of a long effort approaching its end. She thought about the Caldwell letters. She thought about what was in them, not just her own history, but the history of men in that room, the decisions made in the early years of Damien's leadership that had been dressed as strategy and were, in the specific language of those documents, closer to predation. She thought about the Dresch file and what reading it publicly would cost her. She thought about a room of men hearing both sets of documents read aloud and the specific kind of damage that information caused, not just to individuals, but to structures, to the web of agreements and trusts that had taken 40 years to build, and that, once corroded by the particular acid of full exposure, did not rebuild in the same form. She thought about what she had said to Eleanor the previous night. I need to think about what the right outcome actually is. Not for me, for what comes after. The letters stay out, she said. The Dresch file stays out. She paused. In exchange for a full voluntary statement, in your words, in front of both this room and the summit tonight. No documentation, no record beyond the witnesses present, your account of what you did, why you did it, and what it cost. She paused again. And the withdrawal. Complete, formal, final. He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved against the leather of the portfolio. A small, repetitive motion, the kind the body makes when the mind is arriving somewhere it has been resisting. Then he stopped the motion and looked at her with an expression that was not quite anything she had a name for. Not defeat, not relief, not the bitter residue of a man who has lost, but something older and more complicated than any of those. The expression of a man who has been stripped down to something he perhaps did not know was still there. All right, he said. The two words were the quietest things he had said in 30 years of being a loud man. Serena turned to face the 8 men in the seats. We'll reconvene at the main summit tonight, she said. Everything said in this room between now and then is said in the context of that proceeding. If anyone here does not agree to be bound by that context, leave now. Nobody left. She turned back to Damien. You have 4 hours, she said. Use them however you need. She walked off the stage the way she had walked into it, steady, forward, without looking back. And she moved through the wing and into the backstage dark and through the scene dock door and out into the cold late afternoon air of the street. And she stood there for a moment with the door closed behind her, and the city noise around her, and she let out a breath that she thought might have been the first full breath she had drawn since founding night. It was not over. She knew that. There were 4 hours and a summit, and a room full of men making calculations, and Eleanor Voss opening a proceeding in a capacity that would need to hold under pressure, and there were 100 things that could still go wrong in ways she hadn't fully modeled. She knew all of that. She held all of it. She also held the specific feeling of a person who has been running at maximum capacity for 72 hours, and has just, for the first time, been permitted to feel the weight of it. It sat in her chest and her legs and behind her eyes, and she let it be there, because suppressing it required energy she was going to need for the next 4 hours. And there was no one on this street watching her, and she had spent 11 years suppressing things in rooms full of people, and she was, in this particular moment, alone. She stood on the street outside the Aldenmoor for 43 seconds. Then she called Eleanor. He agreed, she said. A pause. The condition? Letters and the Dresch file stay out of the record. She started walking. Voluntary statement and full withdrawal in exchange. That's more than I expected, Eleanor said. He's tired, Serena said. And then, because it was true and she was not going to perform otherwise, so am I. 4 hours, Eleanor said. 4 hours, Serena confirmed. The summit was held in a building that had no name on its exterior, a converted warehouse in the Eastern Financial District that the neutral families used for proceedings that required space, discretion, and the specific architecture of a room where everyone present could see everyone else, which was the physical grammar of a conversation in which no one trusted anyone completely and everyone needed to know where everyone's hands were. Eleanor had arranged the room with the particular precision of someone who understood that the physical arrangement of a space shaped the power dynamics of the conversation held inside it. Not a stage and an auditorium. That configuration belonged to Damien's aesthetic, the theater of authority. Instead, a long oval table, seating for 32, with Eleanor at one end in a chair that was marginally, but perceptibly, more upright than the others. No microphone. No amplification. The room was sized so that a normal speaking voice carried to every seat, which meant that anything said at that table was said to everyone, and anything that anyone tried to murmur privately would be visibly private, which was itself a kind of transparency. Serena arrived at 7:22. She came through the main entrance rather than a service door, which was a choice she had thought about on the drive over. The building's main entrance opened directly into the meeting room, which meant that walking through it meant walking into the sightlines of everyone already seated. She had spent 11 years entering rooms through side doors, the wife's entrance, the secondary corridor, the position that placed her adjacent to power without placing her inside it. Tonight she walked through the main door. The room was nearly full, 28 of the 32 seats occupied when she entered, with the remaining 4 being claimed in the next 6 minutes by men who had timed their arrivals to avoid being either first or last. She took a seat at the table, not at Eleanor's end, not at the far end, but midpoint, which placed her at the geometric center of the oval and meant that everyone on both sides had to turn slightly to see her, which put her in peripheral vision rather than direct sightline for most of the room, which was precisely where she wanted to be. Damien was not in the room when she entered. He arrived at 7:31 with no security. She had told him no security, and he had come without it, which was either trust or the exhausted compliance of a man who had stopped having the energy to negotiate on secondary points. He took a seat on the opposite side of the oval from Serena, 2 positions down from center. He did not look at her when he sat. He looked at the table. Benedict Rowe was in the seat directly across from him. Rowe looked at Damien and then at Serena and then at his water glass, with the expression of a man who has seen many things in his professional life and is in the process of filing this among them. Eleanor stood at 7:35. "I want to address the question of my presence in this role before we begin," she said, and the room settled into the specific quality of attention that attaches to a voice that has decided to be direct. For 22 years, I served the Virelli organization in an advisory capacity. That service ended 8 years ago by mutual decision. I am here tonight at the request of the attending families as a neutral convener. The conflict between those 2 facts is real. I'm not asking you to overlook it. I am asking you to weigh it against the alternative, which is that no neutral party with sufficient standing and knowledge of the current situation was otherwise available, and that proceeding without a convener carried more risk than proceeding with one whose conflict has been disclosed. She paused. If any member of this table moves to challenge my standing, I will hear that challenge first, before anything else. No one moved. Then we'll begin, Eleanor said, and sat. The next 90 minutes were not dramatic in the way that rooms like this were sometimes dramatic in the telling. There were no raised voices, no theatrical confrontations, no single speech that changed everything. What happened was more like the slow drainage of a structure under sustained hydraulic pressure, methodical, incremental, each exchange building on the previous one until the accumulated weight became undeniable. Eleanor moved the proceeding through its stages with the precision of someone who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one and understood that the management of pace was the management of outcome. Let it run too fast, and men made decisions from adrenaline that they unmade by morning. Let it run too slow, and attention drifted and positions hardened. The first stage was documentation. Eleanor read a summary of the events of founding night, not from Serena's perspective, not from Damien's, but from the perspective of the tradition itself. What the ceremony required, what it represented, what the decision to violate it meant in the specific language of the agreements that every family in the room had built their operations on. She read it without editorializing. She let it sit. The second stage was consequence. Coretti spoke first, which surprised Serena. She had expected Rowe, had expected the most senior voice to go first and set the register for everything after. But Coretti spoke, and what he said was not rhetorical and was not strategic. It was operational. He described, in the flat practical language of a man who runs freight corridors and needs those corridors to function, the specific disruptions of the past 72 hours, the frozen routes, the suspended credentials, the broker silence, and he described what they cost and what it would cost to repair them and what the prerequisite for that repair was. He was not making an argument. He was reading an invoice. Halsey followed with the regulatory dimension. The judges who had gone quiet, the commissioners who had stopped answering, the legal infrastructure that had been maintained through Serena's relationships and had dissolved with the violation of the tradition that those relationships were built on. He was equally operational. No one in that room was making speeches about honor or legacy or the sanctity of family tradition. They were making speeches about money and access and the specific practical mechanics of an underworld that ran, like all human systems, on the quality of the agreements holding it together. Damien spoke at 9:14. Eleanor called his name, and he stood, and the room went quiet in the way it had gone quiet in the Aldenmore that afternoon, the particular held breath of a group of people who have been expecting something and are now in the moment of its arrival. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he did not hold anything. No portfolio, no notes, none of the physical props of authority he had spent 30 years learning to deploy. He looked at the oval table and at the 29 faces arranged around it, and he began to speak. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not explain himself. He did not justify the decision he had made at the founding night ceremony, did not build a case for the logic of it, did not ask the room to understand his reasoning. He described what he had done in plain language without softening it. He described the decision to violate the tradition as a decision made from ego dressed as authority, a thing he had told himself was strategy, and that he now understood was the action of a man who had confused the instruments of his power for its source. He described what the past 72 hours had taught him about the difference between fear and respect, and what he had built with the first, and what his wife had built with the second, and what that difference had produced. He described the specific failure of leadership that had led him to a stage in an abandoned opera house this afternoon, and the conversation that had happened there, and the decision he had made. He withdrew. Not the word alone, but the full statement, the formal language of it, the specific phrasing that had legal and operational weight in the context of syndicate governance, the acknowledgement of the council's authority, and the relinquishment of his own. He said it clearly, and he said it once, and he sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Benedict Rowe, who had been the first to not stand at the loyalty oath on founding night, and who was the most senior independent voice in the room, said, "Acknowledged." One word. The same weight as a judge's gavel. Coretti said it. Halsa said it. Down the table it went. Not unanimously, not immediately. Two of the family representatives taking 60 or 90 seconds to sit with it before they added their voice, which Serena noted and respected because it meant they were actually deciding rather than performing agreement. But it went all the way around. The new structure took another 40 minutes to outline. Eleanor had prepared a framework, not a complete document, but the architecture of one, the key provisions that would need to be formalized over the following weeks by the legal teams of the attending families. Shared governance rather than singular authority. A standing council of 5, rotating membership, no single family holding permanent majority. A designated diplomatic liaison role, independent of the council, answerable to the full assembly, responsible for the external relationships that the previous structure had routed through the Donna's office. Eleanor looked at Serena when she described this last role. Serena had known it was coming. She had known it since the previous night in Anselm's when she and Eleanor had worked through the summit framework and arrived at the structural reality that the relationships she had built over 11 years could not simply be dissolved. They were woven into the operational fabric of every family in the room, and the dissolution of the Virelli hierarchy did not dissolve them, it just left them without a caretaker. Someone needed to hold that role. The families would not accept a stranger in it, not immediately, not given the trust required. And Serena was the person those relationships belonged to. She had known it, and she had resisted it, and she had arrived, over the course of a long night and a longer day, at an understanding of what resistance was costing and what acceptance might mean. Not the return of everything she had walked away from, not the Donna's position reconstructed under a different name, something smaller, more honest, a defined role with defined limits and defined accountability, answerable to the council rather than to a single man, doing the work she had always done, but without the architecture of subordination she had always done it inside. The role would require a candidate with existing relationships across all attending families, Eleanor said, and a demonstrated record of operating independently of any single family's interests. She did not say Serena's name. She let the description sit. Rowe said, "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Virelli about her interest in that role before we vote on the structure." Serena stood. She had not prepared remarks. She had prepared enough other things in the past 72 hours that this specific moment, standing up in a room and speaking about herself without a strategy, without a position she was protecting, without the invisible weight of a marriage and a hierarchy and a man's name, had not received its own preparation. She stood, and she found that the absence of preparation was, in this particular room, exactly right. I built what I built because the alternative was being decorative, she said. That's not a political statement. That's a statement about what it cost to be in this world as the person I was in it. She paused. I am not interested in power for the sake of it. I have spent 11 years watching what that appetite does to people, and I know the smell of it from a long distance. She looked at the faces around the oval. What I'm interested in is the work being done correctly, the relationships being held with the respect that makes them durable, the kind of stability that doesn't require fear to maintain itself. She paused. If the council determines that I am the right person to hold that role, I will hold it, with full accountability to this body, with defined limits, with the understanding that the moment the council determines I am wrong for it, I leave without a condition. She paused once more. That's all I have to say. She sat down. The vote on the full structure, including the diplomatic liaison role and its first designated occupant, was completed at 10:47. It was not unanimous. One family representative abstained on the liaison appointment, which Eleanor noted and recorded, and which Serena considered the most honest thing that happened all night, because it meant the vote was real. The building emptied slowly. Not the way events empty when they end badly, everyone moving fast and not meeting eyes, the urgent dispersal of people fleeing a scene. Slowly, men stopping to talk in small configurations, the particular decompression of people who have been in a high-stakes room and need to process it at a human speed before they can move. Serena stayed at the table. She was not ready to navigate the hallway conversations, and she was not going to pretend she was. And the particular freedom of not pretending was something she had not fully identified until this moment as a freedom she had been without for a long time. Roe stopped on his way out. He stood across the table from her and looked at her with the expression she had been reading all week. The expression that combined assessment and something older, something that lived in the part of a long-experienced face that had stopped trying to control its own history. "The necklace," he said. She looked at him. "It's been returned to the Varelli archive," he said. "I took the liberty of arranging it this afternoon, before the summit." He paused. "I thought you should know it's there." She nodded. "Thank you, Benedict." He left without further ceremony, which was the courtesy she appreciated most from him, the understanding that she did not need a speech. Eleanor was the last one in the room besides Serena. She moved through the chairs with the unhurried efficiency of someone tidying a space they take responsibility for, collecting the water glasses and the folders of the framework document, restoring the room to its neutral state. Serena watched her and thought about the conversation in Anselm's and the 40 years Eleanor had spent in this world, and the specific cost of that, which Eleanor had named without naming it. The retirement that was not retirement, the quiet that was not peace. "What do you do now?" Serena asked. Eleanor looked up from the stack of folders. "I go home," she said. "I've been going home for 8 years. The difference is that now I've actually finished." She paused. "You?" Serena considered it. "I go home too," she said. "Eventually." "Where is that?" It was a question she had not thought about in the specific way the word required. Not where she would stay tonight, not where the next meeting was, but home in the older sense, the place that had some quality of belonging in it. The Castello Nero was not it, and had not been for a long time, and she had not fully acknowledged that until this moment. "I don't know yet," she said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "You have time to find out," she said. "That's more than most people in this room can say." She left. Serena sat alone at the oval table for a while. The room without people in it had a different quality, larger, quieter, the kind of quiet that had depth to it, the quiet of a space where something had been completed. The overhead lights were still on, casting the room in the flat, even brightness of institutional lighting that made everything look slightly more real than it did under anything warmer. She looked at the surface of the table, the rings left by water glasses, the slight impressions where pens had rested, the physical residue of a meeting that had changed the shape of things. She thought about Damien. He had left immediately after his statement, not lingering, not speaking to anyone, moving through the room's exit with the particular quality of a man who has said everything he came to say and has nothing left to perform. She had not watched him go. She had felt the door close in her peripheral awareness and had kept her eyes on Eleanor and had not looked at the door. There was nothing in that departure worth watching that she hadn't already seen in the Aldenmore that afternoon. In the moment he had said his condition, and she had looked at his face and found that the man she had expected to feel nothing but contempt for had become, in that moment, something more complicated and less satisfying. Just a man, tired and stripped of the architecture that had made him legible to her for 11 years, standing in bad light in a room where the curtain wouldn't hang straight. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was a word she approached with the caution of someone who had watched it used primarily as a mechanism for making the person who had been harmed responsible for the comfort of the person who had done the harming. What she felt was not forgiveness, and was not its absence either. It was something quieter and less defined. The specific feeling of a person who has carried a heavy thing for a long time and has set it down, and who is now in the first moments of noticing what her hands feel like without it. She left the building at 11:23. The city outside was doing what it did at that hour. The late-night register, the particular quality of urban sound that exists when the productive portion of the day has ended and the overnight portion has not yet fully begun. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt the cold on her face, which was different from the cold of the past 3 days. Those days had been the cold of being in motion, of the body generating its own heat through urgency, through the sustained metabolism of crisis. This was the cold of stillness, the cold of air on skin that was not going anywhere immediately. She walked, not toward anything specific, toward the general direction of the hotel she had arranged for tonight, which was 8 blocks north, but without urgency, with the particular pace of a person who has temporarily given herself permission to be in the space between one thing and the next. The city blocks went past her, a restaurant closing up, someone carrying chairs inside. A cab idling at an intersection, its interior light on. A woman walking a dog that was old enough to be doing it slowly, which the woman accommodated without impatience, adjusting her pace to the dog's and looking at something else, waiting. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. Council framework transmitted to all family legal teams. Garrett has submitted a formal conflict disclosure and stepped back from all neutral broker functions pending review. He says to tell you he's sorry. She read the message twice. Garrett's sorry. 2 words that contained a complicated history, a 17-year-old decision, an 11-year-old silence, and the specific weight of a man who had finally gotten around to saying the thing he should have said when it would have cost him more. She put the phone in her pocket without responding. There was a response she would eventually write, and it would be measured and fair, and she would mean it, because fairness was something she had decided long ago was worth maintaining, even when it cost her. And Garrett's situation was not simple, and she knew that. But the response was not tonight's task. Tonight's task was the 8 blocks to the hotel, and the cold air, and the old dog adjusting her pace. She thought about the ancestral necklace in the Varelli archive. Rowe returning it before the summit, the quiet gesture of a man who understood symbolism not as decoration, but as infrastructure. The necklace in its vault, not on anyone's throat. Not a symbol of ownership anymore, Serena thought. Rowe had been more right than he knew when he phrased it that way. It had always been described as a symbol of the Donna's authority. But what it had actually been, she understood now, was a symbol of the Donna's legibility. The necklace was what made the Donna visible to the room. It was the marker that said, in the language everyone in that world could read, this woman's position is real, is acknowledged, is not informal. Without it, she was invisible, which was why removing it publicly had been the specific kind of violence it was. Not just humiliation, but erasure, the removal of the one marker that made her exist in the room at all. She had walked out of that room anyway, without the marker, without the visibility. She had walked out, and in the days that followed, had proven, through a different kind of evidence, that her existence in the room had never actually depended on what was around her throat. The necklace could stay in the vault. She was 3 blocks from the hotel when she stopped walking. There was a bench at the edge of a small public square. Nothing grand, just the urban remnant of a space that had been designated for sitting in and had been used for it. the wood of the bench worn smooth in the seat by the accumulated patience of 100 years of strangers taking a moment. She sat on it. The cold of the wood came through her coat immediately. She let it. Above the buildings on the south side of the square there was a strip of sky visible. Not dark exactly, the particular deep blue-gray of a city sky at night, with one star visible, or what might be a star, or might be a satellite, or might be a plane, moving too slowly to identify. She sat there for a long time, not thinking about the council or the framework documents, or the calls she would need to make in the morning, or the first meeting of the diplomatic liaison role, or any of the 47 operational matters that would constitute her life for the next weeks and months. She sat and let the cold be cold and the city be the city around her, the distant sound of traffic and a siren somewhere far enough away to be abstract. And she let herself be in the specific unfamiliar territory of a person who has finished something enormous and has not yet started the next thing, and who is, in the gap between them, just sitting on a bench in a square at midnight. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Eleanor in the final hour at Anselm's, when they had finished the framework and put down their pens and sat in the specific exhaustion of two people who have been working at maximum capacity for a long time. Eleanor had said, "The thing about building power inside someone else's structure is that you eventually have to decide if you're building it for them or for yourself." She had not been talking about Damien, she had been talking about herself, about what she had built for Damien's father and what it had cost her, and the question had been addressed to the past, not the future. But Serena had heard it as a question she needed to answer, and she had spent the drive to the Aldenmore and the hours after the summit turning it over, and what she had arrived at was not an answer exactly, but a clarification. She had started building for Damien. That was true. The first years had been survival, and the survival had taken the form of making herself indispensable to a man whose indifference to her as a person was something she addressed as professional arrangement and tried not to feel. She had built for him because it was what was available, and because her options had been narrow, and because the skills she had were the skills that fit the work. But somewhere, she could not name the year, could not locate the specific moment, but somewhere in the middle years, it had changed. Not because she had decided to build for herself, not through a conscious act of reclamation, but through the slow accumulation of relationships and trust and the specific satisfaction of work done well for reasons that were no longer simply survival. The brokers and the family representatives and the ports and the legal contacts and the regulatory relationships, she had maintained those because she cared about the stability they produced, because the stability was real, and people's livelihoods depended on it. And the alternative to stability in their world was violence. And she had spent enough time adjacent to violence to understand that its cost was paid by people who had not made the decisions that produced it. She had built something she believed in. Inside a structure she did not. And when the structure violated itself, the thing she had built had survived the structure's collapse because it had been built on different foundations. She was going to continue building it, on different ground, under her own name, answerable to a council rather than a man, with limits she had agreed to and would hold herself to, in the full knowledge of what she was and what she had done to get here, and what it meant that she was still here. It was not a clean story. It had never been a clean story. The Morvains were still collapsed, and she had been part of that. Dresch was still dead, and she had been part of that too, in a more complicated way that she would spend a long time sitting with. The women who had come before her in this world, Eleanor and the others she had known by name, and the ones she had known only by the spaces they had occupied and the ways those spaces had closed around them. They had made their choices and paid their prices, and none of those prices were canceled by what had happened tonight. But she was here, on a bench in a city square at midnight, cold and tired and alive and no longer performing anything for anyone, and the strip of sky above the buildings was still there. And the light that might be a star or a satellite or a plane had moved slightly to the east, still visible, still crossing. She sat for a while longer. Then she stood and buttoned her coat and walked the remaining 3 blocks to the hotel and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the square was empty, and the bench held the faint warmth of where she had been. And outside the city continued at its overnight register, patient and indifferent, and full of the sound of everything that had not stopped while the world inside one room changed its shape, and the night went on the way nights do, slow and complete, carrying everything forward into whatever came next.